Hello and welcome to episode 721 of People Behind the Science. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today I am joined by our guest, Dr. Sonia Mayoral, to talk about life and science. This episode is made possible with support from our sponsor, Innovative Research. Innovative Research has provided scientists with quality lab products made in Novi, Michigan for more than 20 years. Their portfolio includes human and animal biologicals, assay and ELISA kits, antibodies, and more. Products can be purchased directly from their website by credit card or purchase order at www.innov-research.com. That's www.innov-research.com. They offer small quantities, bulk purchases, and custom orders. From human whole blood to specialized antibodies, Innovative Research has what you need to succeed in the lab. And today, our guest, Sonia, is going to talk more about her lab and her life. So listeners, get ready to meet another one of our exceptional people behind the science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Listeners, today I am excited to speak to our guest scientist, Dr. Sonia Mayoral. So, Sonia, welcome to our show today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
Well, we are thrilled to learn more about you and more about your work today, but let's start with a little bit of background first. So, listeners, Sonia is the Robert J. and Nancy D. Carney Assistant Professor of Brain Science at Brown University. She received her bachelor's degree in biological sciences from San Jose State University and her PhD in neuroscience from Stanford University. Afterwards, Sonia conducted postdoctoral research at the University of California, San Francisco, and she joined the faculty at Brown University in 2021. And Sonia, today we're looking forward to getting to know you, of course, as a scientist, but also as a person. So can you start by telling us what you like to do when you're not doing science?
I have a 4-year-old son, so I mostly try to spend as much time with him as possible outside the lab. And I'm still trying to figure out what I like to do outside. There were a lot of things I used to do before I had him, and it's been definitely a struggle to try to find my groove again. So it's a work in progress.
Absolutely. I think life is a work in progress, so you're not alone there. What are some of your son's favorite things these days?
I hate to say, but he's definitely into sort of video games or like basically the little iPad games. And so one thing that he's really, really excited about is this game called Plants vs. Zombies that he loves to act out outside of playing it. And I often portray a zombie around the house or a plant that's trying to shoot that zombie down.
Well, it sounds like you guys have fun when you're not very busy with work.
Yeah.
And I know it can be hard to balance life and science, and you were doing some amazing work in the lab. So, Sonia, how do you describe what you do to someone who's not familiar with your work specifically, or maybe not in your field at all?
I feel like most people know that the brain is made out of neurons. So I often tell people that I study the other half of the cells that make up your brain that are not the neurons, the glial cells that are doing all sorts of other things that we actually don't know as much about, and could hold a lot of promise as far as finding therapies for neurologic disease.
Very cool. Well, I'm excited to talk more about your specific projects as we go through our conversation today, but I'd love to touch on motivation first. I think as a scientist, there are a lot of competing priorities, a lot of challenges that you face. So getting motivated and staying motivated can be important. So do you have a favorite quote or a saying or just a force that keeps you motivated in everyday life?
I actually do. And this is a quote that I've sort of come across several times. And I think it's a paraphrase. I'm not sure it's the actual quote, but it's basically, if it's not hard, it's not worth doing. I think it's basically a paraphrase of something that Teddy Roosevelt said about not envying the life of someone who's led an easy life. And it just speaks to sort of the challenges and getting out of it what you put into something, right? Doing something. And so I find myself often reminding myself that, because this is a hard field, this is our career. And I feel like I constantly struggle through it. But I do keep sort of a mantra, right? It's worth it. It's worth it. This is why it's worth doing.
Definitely. I love that. And I think it helps highlight that when you are struggling, when you're feeling like you're having a tough time, you're probably on the right path because what you're doing is hard. And so it is worth doing.
Yes. Yeah, I do think so. I think that those are the things in life that make the biggest impact, where you can make the biggest change happen.
Definitely. You're not settling for the low-hanging fruit. I like it. Well, Sonia, it sounds like this is a great motivator for you. And I think not only having these mantras and sayings in your mind can be helpful, but the people that you interact with in science can have a tremendous impact on your career. So whether it's historical figures that you've looked up to or actual mentors that you've had in real life, are there people who really rise to the top of your mind when you think about some of these people who might have had an impact on you in your career?
I've often thought about role models and people I looked up to, and I've never seen anyone in history or that's well known that's been an inspiration that's been more than people in my life. So my research advisors, people who have welcomed me into their labs and started training me and finding something in me, something that maybe the fact that I was hard to work with. Mm-hmm. Working with them and seeing how they do science inspired me more than anything. So especially, I do remember sort of my first research experience as an undergrad at San Jose State, where my research advisor, Dr. David Mathis, who's no longer there, he, I think, moved to Minnesota, welcomed me into his lab before I had ever taken a genetics course. And he was running a genetics lab and was so patient with me and basically made the lab a playground and made it okay for me to mess up, say the wrong thing, and was just the most fun I had, and basically opened up this as a career to me that I would have never thought about pursuing. And I remember so many times being in his lab where I was just like, this is what I want to do. Like, I want to do what he does. Just really, really changing the trajectory of my path.
Oh, absolutely. And I love this idea that you found yourself in an environment where you didn't feel afraid or intimidated, because I think labs can be that way sometimes when you particularly are coming in as an undergraduate student without the experience, without maybe even the foundational knowledge. It can be a little bit intimidating.
No kidding. Yeah. He's really special and just kind. And it's just so much care for people and what they're going through. And so I definitely lucked out in having him as a mentor for a period of my life.
Well, it sounds like you got connected with a great person early on in your scientific career. And I'd love to rewind back even further. You mentioned already as an undergraduate student, you were getting involved in a lab. Where did your interest in science or the natural world begin, Sonia? Was it even before that?
No, it was the last thing on my mind, actually.
Really?
I never saw science being a career for me. My parents were immigrants from Mexico, and they both had very little education. And I think science was also far from their minds as far as a career path for any of their children goes. I think it's a very common thing for immigrant parents to sort of want their children to grow up to be a medical doctor or a lawyer or an engineer, one of those jobs where that's thought of as being highly respected and where you make a lot of money. And starting college, I was really, really lost. I actually, if anything, one of the things I really loved to do was art. And my brother was a much better artist than I was. And I didn't want to compete with him. I knew he was always going to be better. And I knew that was not something that I wanted to get into. So I was trying to find my own thing and trying to find something else. I just sort of said, well, I had taken a biology course in high school. I thought it was kind of fun. And so by elimination, I also eliminated engineering as a career goal just because math was just such a struggle for me. I think in high school, I ended up getting sort of a math achievement award, not because I was good at math, but because I think I took more math classes than anyone.
Oh, wow. The determination award.
It was like a good effort. It's like you made the really best effort. And at some point, I just said that my efforts could be more of use somewhere else. Lawyer was definitely not the path for me. I'm not sure I quite understood what a lawyer does, but I definitely wasn't a talker or could win any argument. So those options, sort of medical doctor, seemed to be something that maybe I could pursue that would make my parents happy. So I sort of took all the pre-med classes in college. I didn't really know what research was until a chemistry professor had suggested that I participate in research and that there was a program that was actually specifically for underrepresented students in the sciences that would pay me to do research in the lab. And what I heard was that I would get paid to go to school. And that seemed amazing. So I didn't really know what I was getting myself into, but I decided to pursue that opportunity, figure out what it was all about. And I was sort of given a list of professors at the university that are doing or participating in research. And I came across Dr. Mathis's name and decided to ask him. He was my first top pick just because he was studying genetics and I was interested in genetics. I mean, I didn't know much about it, but one of my sisters has a genetic disorder. So I was like, well, maybe this will help me understand it better. And it wasn't her particular condition, but it did open me up to the field of neuroscience. He studied these signaling molecules in flies that were well known to signal the development of axons in the nervous system. So they were like guidance cues that would help tell neurons as their processes are growing where to go, where to turn. And it got me thinking about how the brain develops. And in college, you often get very philosophical, start thinking about consciousness and where it comes from. And I had this idea that, well, if you learn how to build the nervous system, then you would know, right? If you could build it, so much would come from that. I became really, really interested in understanding how you build a brain. And I didn't do any of that research there. It was very, very much focused on genetics. And so I think I cloned a Drosophila gene and I didn't touch a fly, actually. I worked mostly with bacteria and I didn't get to study the nervous system at all, but it did open up my eyes to neuroscience as a field and what I could study and just the possibilities. And of course, having joined his lab and being in a lab of such a welcoming and nurturing mentor, everything just grew from there.
Well, that sounds phenomenal, Sonia. I love that you took this logical, structured elimination style approach to choosing your career path. I think that's just evidence right there that you are already a scientist. Well, it sounds like you've found a fantastic niche for yourself in science, and I know you're doing amazing research there in the lab. So is there a project you're working on right now at the moment, Sonia, that you are the most excited about and want to share with me and our listeners?
So I mentioned earlier that I studied the non-neuronal cells in the brain. And I kind of laugh at myself for this because for the longest time, I was not interested in studying these cells. I wanted to study neurons. They're the stars of the show, or so I thought. And it took me a long time to appreciate these other cells for what they are. And over the years, I mean, I remember trying to study neuronal development at many points in my career and things directing me, always pointing me toward the glia in a really funny way. And I've somehow embraced it finally and am really, really interested in what these cells are doing. And in particular, I study myelinating glia in the brain. These are also known as oligodendrocytes. And these are the cells that wrap myelin, or this insulating sheath around neuronal axons. And its most famous function, or most famous role for this insulation, for this myelin, is that it increases the speed at which neurons can fire these electrical impulses. So it basically allows for fast thinking, fast movement, anything that happens quickly in the brain, any cell communication between neurons that is fast is because of myelin. And for a long time, that was the only role that we knew that it did. They were just these cells that wrap neurons and help them fire faster. But we've been learning over the years that they're doing much more. It's a similar story with most other glial cells in the brain too. So there's evidence now that they provide metabolic support to the neurons they wrap. They also seem to have a protective role that we've known a long time because of diseases like multiple sclerosis, where this myelin sheath is actually damaged. And if it's not repaired, the neurons are likely to degenerate and die. But if they remyelinate, then they survive. So it sounds like it's serving this protective role, but we have no understanding of the mechanisms that underlie that protection. And we also know that there's a lot of really recent, exciting evidence that shows that it's actually really, really critical. The formation of new myelin around axons is really critical for things like learning and memory. But we have no idea how it's doing it, the mechanisms that underlie these roles. And so it's something that I'm really interested in uncovering is what more is myelin doing to these axons? Like, how is myelin changing the axons to allow for protection or to allow for, I guess, changes in memory? And how does wrapping a neuron translate to increased memory? So I studied this in mouse models. And so I've developed a mouse model where myelin is sort of lacking from certain areas where it normally would be. So these are mutant mice. And by being able to restrict where the cells that make myelin can go, I can sort of restrict the production of myelin around these neurons. And in particular, I'm looking at the optic nerve, which is one of the most highly myelinated regions in your central nervous system. Nearly every axon is almost fully myelinated in this nerve. And in these mice, half of the neurons are myelinated. So you have this really nice compare and contrast situation where you can have half of the axons that are myelinated and half of them that are not. So you can kind of compare and contrast what's different. Like, how is myelin changing these axons here versus in this region where it's not present? So I'm using this model in this system in particular to see how myelin is changing axon structure and function locally.
Well, I think this is so cool, Sonia. And I love that you're really helping to illuminate and bring to the forefront these very underappreciated cells in the brain. I think that is so important to kind of investigate these mysteries that remain there. And it's not without challenge. We touched on this previously. Science is often a struggle, but I love sharing these stories of struggle because I think people don't often get to see them. They see the finished product. They see the papers published, the presentations when everything looks like it's gone so smoothly. So do you have a story, Sonia, of something that you struggled with in science or maybe a daily challenge that you face that you could tell us a little bit more about?
It's so funny. I feel like everything is a struggle. Doing lab work is not something that comes easy to me by any means. I feel like I struggle at nearly every aspect of science every day. And maybe that's why I keep doing it, because it's not boring. It's always a challenge for me and sort of keeps me interested and keeps me wanting to get better at it. One thing I do want to bring up, speaking about these underappreciated cells or not as well recognized, is this idea that as a Mexican American, as a Latina in science, there aren't many of us doing it. And I think it's one of the things in the big picture that I also have struggled with, right? Is not just the daily work, but feeling like there's a place for me in science, like feeling like this is a place where I belong, especially since it's such a challenging job for me. So it's something that I feel really passionate about, having more of us, increasing our representation in science. You mentioned earlier, we were talking about role models, and all my role models were white men. Those tended to be my advisors. I remember in graduate school, in particular, I sought out a woman. I wanted to be in the lab of a woman who had kids because I wanted to make sure that I figured out how you do that. How are you women in science? And how can you balance having a family and being a woman in science? Like all the challenges that we face. But I guess one thing that I wanted to say about this struggle is I think one of the things that has sort of realized at some point is that being from a background that's been marginalized, I guess, for a really long time from the sciences, that I sort of see this parallel with studying a cell that's been sort of marginalized.
You empathize.
And I think it's one of the things that's also helped make me very, very passionate about the work I do, is that I see my struggles and my life reflected in this cell in the brain, or this sort of group of cells that has been unappreciated for a really, really long time, but they have really important roles and could have a much bigger part of controlling or regulating our brain function than we appreciate. And I feel like this diversity of cells and the diversity of people doing science, like it's a sort of a similar struggle. It's a similar battle that we're fighting here. And it made me more passionate and excited about studying cells because I sort of see myself also reflected in them.
Well, Sonia, I'm so glad you brought this up because I think increasing representation of all these minority groups in science is so critical. And I'm curious, how do you handle or how do you persevere through some of these feelings that you have when you look around and you don't see others like yourself in the room, or just that feeling like, is there a place for me?
I guess one thing is not giving up. Being hopeful for the future, that change is being made. And I do see change happening. I do see people caring about increasing this representation, about having a more diverse group of scientists pursuing these questions, or wanting to make this place a place that is open to everybody. And I see those intentions. And so just having people supporting that are supporting and do find that being something important to change in science does help. So one of the reasons why I think Brown is actually such a great place, I feel like the community here, the department here, the people here, the faculty here, the students here, it's a really important mission for everyone here. And that definitely helps keep me going. Being in a good and healthy environment that's supportive of me and is welcoming to me here really, really helps with that struggle, I guess.
Absolutely. And I think you are part of the solution yourself, just kind of being someone that the students, the next generation of scientists can look up to as well. So I think we are making this very slow progress on this front in science. And we love talking about, even if it's just the incremental wins, the slow progress, the successes in science. I think these stories are really important to share to give people hope, because there's often a lot of challenge that leads to the point of finally getting a win. So do you have a favorite success story in science, Sonia, that you'd like to share?
I could talk about the most recent success. And it took me a while to see it as success. I had to flip it around. So I've started up my lab in 2021, so not too long ago. And like everything, it's been a struggle to get projects going and run experiments and analyze the data and have something to show for it, right? And I've spent the last 2 years training people, setting up systems, and everything that could go wrong probably went wrong. So I recently attended a Glial conference. This is an international conference for Glial research. And I presented our work. And I remember being really anxious about it because I was hoping it was going to be a lot more. You register for these conferences and you submit an abstract hoping that you're going to have a lot to show, like hoping that you have like a nice body of work to show. And I thought so much more would be done by the time I would get to present. And most of it was by the time I presented the work, but some of it was done. And I had to change that perspective in my mind, that going from feeling defeated and thinking, oh my God, I didn't get as much done as I hoped, and feeling like a failure in that sense. But then actually taking another look at it and saying, we got something done.
Right.
Like there was stuff, I did have something to present. There wasn't as much, but there was some solid data, some experiments. And what was really great about it was that it was one person's project, but a lot of people in the lab contributed to the data. And so I had some behavior data that some undergrads were working on and they analyzed, and that was able to get on there. And then there was a graduate rotation student who sort of had a project that ended up working out really nicely, and that was able to be on it. And then obviously the work of a research assistant in my lab that's been struggling for the last 2 years trying to get this work. I mean, we didn't get as much up there as we would hoped, but she had some beautiful images to show. And so while they weren't quantified, there was something to show. And so just seeing it from that view, that seeing the glass half empty versus half full, I guess, and finally being able to see it as a success and being able to present it proudly, that this is what we have versus being disappointed in what we have to show. It's so funny. So many things can be seen that way. Glass empty, glass full. So what I originally felt was a failure, I was able to turn into a success, because why not? We could all use more success.
Oh, I love it. Well, Sonia, I think oftentimes in science, the people who are actually drawn to science are these kind of type A perfectionist sorts of people where you're often your biggest critic. And I think taking a moment to step back and just say, hey, I have this new lab that is successfully doing science. That is a win, and that should definitely be celebrated.
Yes, I think so.
Well, congratulations on the success, Sonia. I'm so glad to hear you were able to start up your lab. And it sounds like you've got some phenomenal people on your team who are contributing to the work being done there. And I know success in science is definitely a team effort, from your collaborators and lab members to the people who are working hard to make sure you have all of the supplies and materials that you need for your lab. And on that note, we'd like to take a moment to thank our episode sponsor, Innovative Research, and to talk about their portfolio of ELISA kits, which offer high sensitivity, specificity, and can be used for a wide range of applications. Innovative Research ELISA kits are manufactured in their lab in Novi, Michigan, and are shipped directly to your location. They're a valuable tool for researchers and clinicians who need to detect and quantify specific biomolecules. Visit www.innov-research.com to view their entire line of ELISA kits. And I think as a scientist, it's easy to get wrapped up in your research and to spend all of your time thinking about it, reading about it, and doing it. But we love to encourage our listeners to take a step back, to take a moment to read and reflect. So, Sonia, we love sharing book recommendations with all of our listeners out there. So do you have a favorite book, or maybe one that you've read recently, that you want to recommend for everyone?
I do. So this is actually a book that was recommended to me by a colleague here at Brown, and it's called Community as Rebellion, A Syllabus for Surviving Academia as a Woman of Color by Lorgia Garcia Peña. And I think it's a wonderful read to me because the author does such a great job at explaining the struggle. And it's also really terrifying to read because this is a case of a Harvard professor who did everything right. She did everything she was supposed to do right. I mean, that's as far as on the books, right? She got the funding. She has the publication. She has the great teaching evaluations and is making huge impacts and changes and positive changes in the department and got denied tenure.
Oh, no. That's heartbreaking.
Yes, it's super heartbreaking. And I'm actually not finished. I'm still reading through it. It's just explaining why she thinks it is. And I think the lesson is that you can't do it alone, that you need a community to do it. And she argues that, I think she, as a woman of color, we were talking about increasing diversity and making these changes happen. And I think that in her case, she felt that she was the one, that she was a single person trying to make these changes happen and making it too easy for people just to point at her versus getting a community together, getting people on your side and not doing it alone. So being an early assistant professor,
you're sweating a little.
I guess it's really kind of terrifying, right, to read as an early career faculty here, because basically it's saying that you could do everything that you're supposed to do and you can still be denied this big goal that you're working toward. And just thinking about what tenure means, and I guess seeing this all as a bigger picture, like it's more than just funding publications and teaching. It's much more than that. And figuring out how to navigate all those other things and what they are. So it's not a happy book, but I think it's very real and honest. And it's a really, really important perspective to understand. And so it's definitely giving me more tools, or I guess making me wiser for what to expect, which I really appreciate.
Absolutely. I think this sounds like a really impactful book. I'm glad you mentioned it so we can put it on our website for our listeners to find. And I think it really drives home that no matter where you are, no matter what's happening in your life or in your career, there are just sometimes going to be factors out of your control. And so you just have to focus on the things you can control, try to advance your career, try to build that community, that support network, and acknowledge that whatever happens, happens to some extent. Wonderful book recommendation to share with me and our listeners. And we talked about some different aspects of your career, Sonia, but I'd love to touch on travel. You mentioned this recent conference that you and your lab members were able to contribute to through your presentation. And I'd love to talk about travel because I think a lot of people who aren't familiar with careers in science maybe don't realize that this is actually a pretty big part of the career. You get to travel all over the world, to go to meetings, to go to conferences, and share your work with colleagues. So do you have a favorite place that your science has taken you?
I was able to travel as a grad student to a conference. I was able to get sort of reimbursed for a room at a hotel, and just letting my family piggyback on that trip was so much fun. So we were crowded in this little space, but they were able to experience something that they wouldn't elsewhere. And so going to Hawaii, of course, is amazing, right? It was also my first time in Hawaii, and going to the beaches there and experiencing all that Hawaii has to give, but being able to be there with my family who would not have that opportunity otherwise or wouldn't have done it, and being able to treat them to something like this, I really, really enjoy. And to have them talk about it years and years later, they still talk about it. We should do another family trip. I mean, we haven't.
COVID didn't help, but
it never happened again. But for years and years, just remembering having these memories of that trip and being able to look upon it just really impacted my family and people, of course, that I love and I'm really close to. And so I think I have to say that those trips where I've been able to share it have been the best.
Absolutely. I think being able to travel for science is such a perk because not only do you get to meet cool people in your field during the scientific events, but oftentimes you are able to add a little bit of time either before or after the conference or even just after conference hours to do something fun with either your colleagues, family who've traveled with you. So do you remember, were there any particularly memorable things that you guys did while you were there in Hawaii?
Oh my gosh, just being on the beach for long periods of time. My nieces and nephews, so I had really young nieces and nephews that came along on that trip in particular. And just watching them have so much fun at the beach was really fun. We also, I think at the time, we were in time for the Spam Jam.
Oh, wow.
They had a big parade and celebration, all Spam themed, and having fun in the streets. It was also really, really fun. But it's just those long hours just on the beach in this beautiful beaches. Oh my goodness. And I remember, so there was the whole work aspect, but being able to sort of meet up with them after it. I do look at it just like just super, super happy memories that I'll always cherish.
Well, it sounds absolutely amazing. And of course, serendipitous that you were able to time it with the Spam Jam. Did you get to sample any Spam?
I'm not a fan, but people love it.
There's a certain niche.
Yes.
Well, we talked about travel as one of these gems of careers in science, and I think you're absolutely right there. And I think your colleagues also can be these amazing, creative, funny, phenomenal people. And I think that's not oftentimes how people think about or how people perceive scientists to be based on what they see in the media. So we love breaking some of these stereotypes that people have by talking about these human moments in science, the quirky traditions, the funny memories that you share. So do you have an example, Sonia, of one of these stories of your own that really showcases this human side of science?
I have to look back at my postdoc experience. My research advisor there was just as quirky as they get. I'm not sure he would be happy to hear that, but I guess I don't know if it was a lab tradition, not everyone participated, but I do remember that the lab as a group would go take these fitness classes. There was always this big to do in the lab, like, oh, did you sign up for like the BOSU class or for like the body combat class or whatever class? It was always a topic of conversation, like signing up for the class and then going. And I'm not sure everyone enjoyed that aspect. There's a lot of people that didn't participate in the lab and they're like, no,
right.
I'm not putting myself through like an hour crazy workout where I'm going to pass out. But some of us did. And I've never been in better shape.
Right.
I remember my research advisor and I don't know why we did this, but we would do like back-to-back workout for like 2 hours straight.
Oof.
And just like annihilate our body.
That's impressive, though. You were building your stamina.
I mean, in a way, it was kind of fun. Like, we were challenging our minds and our bodies.
So what was the hardest class? Do you remember?
I think it was BOSU. It kind of looks like half of those big exercise balls. Like if you cut it in half and stay flat. So a lot of the exercises you do is you're balancing on this thing.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And like, so you're doing squats and push-ups and lunges on this. It hurts.
Yeah. Muscles you never knew you had, right?
Yeah. And a big part of it was just making fun of each other because we just couldn't do it a lot of times or just had to stop. And there's a lot of really friendly competition. I'll always look at it as a really fun lab tradition.
Well, I love this idea of having kind of a lab fitness community. I think that's a good motivator. If the rest of your colleagues are going out there participating in exercise classes, you feel like you should too, at least.
Exercise, any scientist will tell you, right, that it's definitely a good thing and benefits your body a great deal. And you should do more of it always. And so it was nice that it was such a part of the lab culture. And I feel terrible because I definitely benefited from it and thought it was great. But I know that there were people in there who were just like constantly like shaking their heads at us.
And I think that's totally fine to have sort of like multiple groups within a lab where they can get together, do something a little different. And yeah. I think building that sense of community is so important in science. And I know it sounds like your lab already, even just a couple of years in, has a great sense of community and you're tackling some tough problems in science. And I know oftentimes things like small details like funding, staff, technology, feasibility often hold you back, Sonia. So if we took away all of the limiters, what is the one research question that you would want to answer most?
One of the things that I find extremely, extremely fascinating about these myelinating glia cells is that our bodies, we have two types. We have in our central nervous system, we have one type of myelinating glia. And in our peripheral nervous system, we have another type of myelinating glia. And they both myelinate axons and they have a lot of the same proteins and do a lot of the same things, but they're completely different cells with completely different functions and roles and from completely different origins. And why our bodies, like how we evolved two different cells that basically do the same thing in these different compartments of our nervous system, like is one of the most interesting questions. It's like this evolutionary, the why question, right? Which is not something that's easy to study, but it's just endlessly fascinating that they're just so similar and so different. There's a reason why. One of the big differences between these cells is in the central nervous system, these myelinating cells, once they myelinate, that's sort of it. When they don't demyelinate, they sort of hang on to their myelin and remain these mature oligodendrocytes for the rest of your life. Whereas the myelinating cells in your nervous system, they can myelinate and they can demyelinate. And then they become another different type of cell. So they're much more plastic and sort of shapeshifters. and why the cells in our central nervous systems don't have that flexibility, don't have that plasticity. There's got to be a reason why these cells are as stable in their central nervous system versus our peripheral nervous system, where they're just so flexible. It's something I think about a lot, but I have no idea how to ever tackle that question.
Oh, well, Sonia, I love these big questions that you gave me and our listeners to think about today. And I think it is so exciting in science to be able to be continuing to dig into these big mysteries that remain. And for our listeners out there who might be on their own scientific journeys, we love to share advice on the show. So do you have a piece of advice that someone gave you at some point that really helped you and you can pay forward to our listeners today?
I'm not sure exactly where I first heard this piece of advice, but it's basically do what scares you. One of the things that I hate feeling is fear. I hate that I'm so afraid of so many things. I guess maybe you have some choice in the matter, but it's definitely something that I followed going through my life is, I've come across things that I'm really scared of. One of the big ones being fear of failure. I'm scared of failing constantly. And the way to conquer that fear, I guess, is I just go for it. If something is really, really scary, I feel like I got to do that then. I can't be scared of it. And every time I've done it, every time I've done something or pursued something that scared me, like in my career, it's always ended up being a huge boon, right? It's always been a really great thing or something that I look back on and feel really good about, or it's been a big achievement. I don't think it's always the wisest thing to do. I think there's some things that if they scare you, maybe you should stay away from.
Right. That's the evolution kicking in to say like, all right, that's probably not good for survival.
Yeah, but there are other things, right? And it's like, I hate being afraid. And I often feel like I'm my own worst enemy. That fear holds me back from accomplishing so much more. And so trying to embrace it, seeking it out in some ways, I think has led me to sort of where I am now. And it's funny, like when I think about failure, it's one of the things that scares me the most. And I think one of my missions in life is to fail. I just want to fail. I want to get it over. The anticipation of failure is the worst. In a way, I'm just trying to fail as big as possible so I could just get that over and not be afraid of it anymore. Maybe I'm really lucky in that I still haven't come across that big failure. Maybe it's another one of those things where it's just the perspective. Like, is it really a failure? In actuality, what is that failure? What does that look like? Because I think oftentimes it's not really failing, it's learning. And it's one of the big lessons I think that I'm trying to get across to people in my lab and students that are coming up in the program is I think a lot of people have that fear. I know I'm not unique in this. I know it's a big fear that a lot of people have. And technically you fail so much. Like there's so many failures in the lab. It's one of those things that you just have to get comfortable with. And in a way, transform it, that it's not really a failure. It's sort of how you learn. It's not failing. It's actually learning. So in that sense, I think it's something that's helped drive me is to embrace it. And I think that you're afraid of things for a reason, and pursuing those things, I think, can really take you places, pushing you and helping you accomplish things that you may never thought that you would have been capable of.
Definitely. I love this shift in perspective, kind of thinking about failures more as opportunities, we'll call them, to grow, to learn, and not to let this fear keep you from trying these things that you might be interested in or that you might be worried that you might fail at. I think that is such a powerful message. Sonia, do you have any other last piece of advice or a last note of inspiration that you want to leave everyone with at the end of our conversation today?
Having just talked about not being afraid, I mean, you can be afraid, but not letting it stop you from doing it. And it's sort of along those lines of basically following your dreams. And I don't think people can hear it too much, that it's worthwhile to push yourself and to do things or pursue things that you think you might not see or might be afraid of or might think that they are not for you. If it's something that you want to do, then go for it. And all you have to do is keep pursuing it. And as long as you don't stop pursuing it, as long as you keep taking steps toward it, you'll get there. All you have to do is just keep going.
I love it. I think that persistence, that perseverance is absolutely key. So thank you so much for sharing that message with our listeners. If they want to reach out or maybe learn more about you or your research, Sonia, what is the best way for them to do so?
I guess the best way would be to go to my lab website. You can Google the Mayoral Lab. I actually have the address here. It's sites.brown.edu/Mayoral Lab/ And that'll take you to my lab's website, and you can learn about the research that we're doing, and my email's on there if you want to reach out.
Fantastic. Well, listeners, definitely check out Sonia's website, learn more about her work, and get in touch if you have questions. And Sonia, thank you so much for sharing your time and your stories with us today.
Oh, thank you so much. And also, thank you all for listening.
Well, it's been a pleasure to have you with us, listeners. Always great to have you here as well. And we'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science.